Not long ago, we talked about church libraries and how these resources can help Christians find the best books, including, if not now, then in the future, Christian-made fantastical fiction. What then about public libraries? How can Christians best discern and enjoy this resource? Today we are speaking with a public library director who also happens to be a prolific Christian novelist of sci-fi, fantasy, steampunk, paranormal suspense, and beyond, Steve Rzasa, and he is the first Steve for our new saga of epic episodes that we are assembling for September here on Fantastical Truth. Welcome anew to Fantastical Truth, a podcast from Lorehaven.com. Here we explore fantastical stories for God's glory and apply their meanings to the real world Jesus calls us to serve. I'm Stephen Burnett. I publish Lorehaven. I'm also the co-author of The Pop Culture Parent.
And I'm Zackary Russell. And no offense to our guest today, but my favorite librarian will always be Conan the Librarian from the 1980s Weird Al Yankovic movie UHF. But this is episode 128. How can Christian fans engage their local libraries? And yes, we'll be joined by librarian and author Steve Rzasa.
This episode is part one of our Steve Saga, a new epic trilogy for the month of September. Today we have the first Steve, and in our next episode we will have an additional Steve, and then for the trilogy ender we will have a finale Steve, and then who knows, the franchise may be ripe for expansion with even more Steves beyond that. We'll have to see if we can get even more sequels, maybe a reboot or two out of this franchise. We're looking forward to taking a behind-the-scenes look in Christian publishing, where these stories come from, how they get shared, and that's what Steve Rzasa, who makes many of these stories himself, will be sharing today at the public library level.
Boy, that would be funny if, we put this filter on the show that from now on your name must be Steve to join. First name, last name, Stevenson. Steve, obviously you're Steven, which I didn't even think about you as Steve. Did anyone ever call you Steven?
Every once in a while, and it may come up as we go forward into this series. Whereas another cinematic universe of stories has a lot of Chris's among the cast. It just seems that Christian publishing, for some reason, has a lot of Steves. But I will note, too, that in the Marvel Universe, a surprising amount of superheroes have the name Steve. Steve Rogers, Stephen Strange, even Moon Knight, I think, has the name Stephen. So obviously, there's just something about the name Stephen or Steve that makes you into a hero. Speaking of which, speaking of Christian publishing, let's go real quick to our cover sponsor for this episode. Once again, it is Enclave Publishing. That is our cover sponsor here, focusing on the novel Flight by Kristen Young, which is coming out on September the 13th. Here's the cover description. On the cusp of graduation, Cadence is finally feeling in control. She's about to become one of the prestigious elites working in the Hall of Love. Plus, she can take her place as a full member of the underground sirens who meet secretly in Love City. She will finally be able to use her memory skills for good instead of reporting people as a watcher. But a dangerous trap is set, throwing Cadence into unwelcome and unfamiliar territory. Someone in the collective remembers things that could very well get her killed. The Muse is by her side after all, but will she be protected when someone powerful wants her dead? Enclave Publishing presents Flight by Kristen Young, the third book in the Collective Underground series. It's available September 13 wherever books are sold. It's also available in audiobook format from Oasis Audio. You can get the links to Amazon and christianbook.com to purchase Flight, as well as the Audible link for the upcoming audiobook. Flight by Kristen Young. Get those links in our show notes for this episode 128, or be going to lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors. I suddenly hear some triumphant sounding march music composed by the late Jerry Goldsmith and warp engines in the distance, blinking into that little shine of light into the distant blackness of space. Let's see who's arriving via starship. Library director and novelist Steve Rzasa has just arrived via Federation starship, traveling at just over Warp 5. Steve Rzasa doesn't slay monsters, but he defeats word count goals and vanquishes overdue books. He's the author of many novels of science fiction and fantasy, including the award-winning tales Broken Sight, Mercury on Guard, and Mercury at Risk. When he's not writing, he is running a library in Wyoming. Find his stories at steverazza.com and find Steve Rzasa himself in the studio. Steve, thanks for joining us to be our first Steve of the Steve Saga.
Thanks for having us, Stephen, or having me here with you guys, I should say.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
Zach?
So tell us, Steve, how did you discover biblical truth in fantastical stories? So how did you, and which came first, and when did you accept Aslan as your personal lion and savior, as we like to say?
Boy, that's a really loaded question. Well, I had always been sci-fi, space opera, nerd, geek, whatever you want to call it. Grew up watching Next Generation, had watched some of the original Star Trek, loved Star Wars, so I can fan about both of those equally and share in the joy. But really, the tie between the faith part didn't come. I was working on some ideas when I kind of came back to the Christian faith, I guess you could say, when I was in college. And most people have stories about people losing their faith in college, and mine was the opposite for that because
so
I was
reconstruction. There you go. That's how you do it.
There we go.
Yes.
It was a journey from getting done with Vatican II Catholicism that I grew up in as, slightly better than C&E during those days, and then not much of anything, and then getting into the more evangelical side of things. Later, eventually becoming a Lutheran, but that's a long story.
You swam the Tiber back the opposite direction. Very much a
Yeah,
contrarian. I appreciate it.
Right? I tend to do that. But one of the things that really got to me, the two biggest influences, I would say, especially on my space opera writing, were Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy from the secular side of things, and from the Christian side of things, Chris Wally's Lamb Among the Stars.
Oh, yes.
Really,
my absolute favorite.
Really, that's the one where I went, wow, you can actually do this and make it good.
Not to mention, it's an end times perspective. It's not often seen in Christian futuristic fiction. Zach's often referenced this underappreciated, lesser known series as being a rare example of post millennial prophecy type series.
Yeah, and it's not the eschatology I particularly hold to, but that's what I love about it, is that it's so different and it's so like imaginative, and it's just this whole other universe basically that it's fun to consider.
And the other one I almost forgot about, and I'm kicking myself for almost forgetting about, is Kathy Tyer's Firebird series. Those two were the biggest influences on leaning me toward that biblical truth in a fantastical story world.
Yeah.
Again, they both take these suppositions of, what if something different happened with the faith that we all kind of take for granted, and then just run with it and create these two really amazing story universes.
Yeah. Okay. So now, as a Trekkie, I'm sure you've got your top 10 or top 2 or 3 Star Trek Next Gen episodes, and I've got mine. But what are yours?
Well, definitely Best of Both Worlds.
Yeah, I knew
those
he was
two
say that
back to back. Yeah, I mean,
yes,
you kind of have to. It's one of the articles of the creed of the Next Generation.
Part 1 was the first Star Trek TNG episode I remember actually seeing. So what a high point!
That's cool.
Jump into the deep
discover
end.
the series.
Right?
Yes.
Let me think. What are some other ones I really liked? I can't remember the name of the two-parter, but I always got a kick. It wasn't the best episode, but I always got a kick out of the one where Picard was pretending he was among a bunch of space pirates. I can't remember. It was the one that had to do with like some sort of ancient Vulcan psionic weapon that would like use your own fear and anger to kill you if somebody zapped you with it or something like that.
Okay.
It was a really kind of fun and different back-to-back set of episodes. Gambit, is that what it was called? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just looking at memoryalpha.fandom because I'm not much of a Trek nerd.
There's something about like Picard had a archaeologist friend who died or something, I think, and he kind of picked up the mystery. But I liked it because, we'd had multiple seasons of Picard's Dixon Hill on the holodeck solving mysteries there. And this was like he finally got to apply it to real world. And you could just kind of see he was like, yay. And he was undercover.
And he's got that, archaeologist bent. Okay, now this is interesting. I just, this is a real deep nerd dive here, but I just pulled this up on Memory Alpha, and the teleplay was by Naren Shankar, who was the showrunner for the Expanse series.
Oh, that's
just
why that
finished on Amazon.
That
so that's
cool.
really interesting to see that he got started with this. I don't remember this episode. I'm gonna have to go back and watch this now.
I had just binge watched some Next Generation this summer and earlier this year, I think, and picked up on it again. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that one. And the other one, of course, that I really like must be Chain of Command. again, it's one of those ones where they're like doing their Black Ops mission and Jellicoe's in charge of the Enterprise and things. I just thought it was really I I like some of these character deep dive type of things. So this whole thing with Riker is used to Picard as his commander. Now he's got this other
Yeah.
dude in charge, and Riker's like, how do I Riker with
Yeah.
with this guy
With
around?
this
It's like,
guy, yeah.
no, you're gonna have to get in the chair the front way this time, son. You're
Yeah.
just gonna have to do it.
So
Okay.
Jellicoe was the temporary
Yeah,
captain.
Admiral-
Jellicoe's become a meme now. He tells
Yes,
bad jokes in the
there's
memes.
a whole Twitter channel I follow called like Jellicoe Star Trek or something, and it's just
I've seen
like
a
all
few of
these
those.
like random like
It's
like
just the
insane
name.
kind of
Just the
things
last
that he
name.
might have
It
said.
sounds like
Yeah.
a goofy name. That's why it took off and became a meme, I guess.
And it's just like, out of the rest, everybody at the clip is like, what? I've seen a few of those. They're pretty good. But I think those, it's funny that I think those are the ones I remember the most are the 2-part ones. Just
Oh,
because
yeah.
maybe it's just because it's an extended story and they pack a whole lot more in. But I think those 3 are really my top ones that I can remember going, wow, those are cool and I want to see it again.
Nice.
So those stories plus the books that you read, and we'll get to more of your stories in the Rzasa-verse, which is my name for it. I don't think it's your name. I don't think it's
I
on
like
your
it.
website.
I'm good.
But I'm just
Sure.
going to call it that. Yeah, it's all connected, folks. It's all part of the Steve Rzasa multiverse. But it's not only Star Trek, but stories like the Timothy Zahn novels, the Kathy Tyers books as well that helped push you down this path. And by the way, now that we're into the Steve saga, Steve One here has just accidentally planted an Easter egg for the origin story of Kathy Tyers' books that we get to in our next episode. That'll be episode 2 of the Steve saga. So stay tuned. Definitely pay more of your theater dollars for this ever expanding franchise. So, Steve, in addition to making books, you are also helping to loan books. You are the director of the public library there in Wyoming. Which leads us to chapter 1 here. Why do public libraries still matter in an internet age? We want to talk about the public library as an idea, as a resource that Christians can still enjoy. Despite some controversies going on, I view the public library as still an instrument of God's common grace. What's your take on that, especially when, well, I can just stay at home and order all my books from Amazon, or maybe pirate books, or get them for free, or why do we still need public libraries?
Part of it is that sometimes you have people like me who, as much as I think ebooks are a good thing and it's really handy that people can read them, I just can't read ebooks. It's a weird thing. It's not that they're not good, because the same story to me, I can read it in paperback and love it, but I try to read it in the ebook form, I just can't. I don't know if it's a concentration thing or what it is, because I can read blogs and shorter things all day. Just something about the way I'm wired, it's got to be a paperback for me. And it's not even like a philosophical difference type of thing. It's just something about I start doing it, I'm like, I can't pay attention, or I don't know if I get distracted or what, but when it's a book, I can really hunker down and dive into it. So I think there's still a lot of people who are like that. Another thing to consider too is that as good as ebooks are, it really, from what I can tell, hasn't supplanted children's books. Because with a lot of children's books, especially for early elementary age, there are those big, wide format, but thin ones where you pop them open and there's just gorgeous artwork and stuff like that. And good stories in them too, of course. But you can't really replicate that big, open it on your lap with your kid format when it's on a device that tends to be this small, unless you have a tablet that's like, 15 inches wide or bigger.
or it's the year 2035 and the ebooks have gone holographic. But even then, that would not be tangible. Like, you've got this hologram technology. It's not something you can touch. It's not an object that takes up space, that literally feels weighty, and it adds importance and significance to the joy of reading.
Right. And I think that's part of it for a lot of people too. And so, just anecdotally from our own experience at our small library in Buffalo, Wyoming, up in the northeast part of the state, we have seen more of a shift to ebook and a decline in regular book reading. But the biggest decline really has been in nonfiction versus fiction. Like, our fiction stats for physical books are fairly steady. They're not really spiking and they're not dropping either. But nonfiction has been on a kind of steady decline, at least for us. And it's not too surprising when we start looking into what kind of books you're talking about, because really people are still reading biographies, history, politics, things like that. The books they aren't reading and used to read a lot of are craft books, cookbooks, even self-help to some extent. Those I feel
are
like
all things you can get on the internet.
Exactly. Now, you can get a biography on the internet, but it's it's close enough, I feel like, to fiction in the storytelling sense than something like that in a how-to book would be, if that makes sense. It's more like the biographies and other things like and historical books have really leaned into telling it more like a narrative story than a textbook.
Hmm.
To explain a little bit, Nathaniel Philbrick, if you've never read any of his history stuff, I highly recommend his books. He's got some really good ones that I've used for inspiration on various things. But again, it's so we've seen that kind of shift. We have seen, especially in the past couple of years with COVID, more of a lean toward ebooks. It's become a much bigger part of our circulation locally, and part of that is just because about half of that circulation has been in audio. The audio explosion has really been something we've noticed too. So I feel like it's one of those things where it's becoming a mix. Ebooks have supplanted part of physical reading habits, but not replaced all of it. And they probably won't replace all of it. I think it'll just become another thing that libraries offer. And it may vary where you are and what part of the country you live in and what audience there is as to how much of it. But I don't think it's going to be an ever replace it kind of thing.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me that ebooks are, you find that a challenge. I've read a lot of studies about this that, with the physical book, you have a 3D sense of space, front to back, top to bottom. And you can actually remember, like your brain can remember where in the book, in like a 3D coordinate, you read something. Whereas with an
Oh,
ebook, it's a flat 2D experience, and so there's no sense of like where in the book was that thing, and we actually remember things much more easily and accurately from physical books than with ebooks. And I say this as someone who has hundreds of Kindle books, and I love having Kindles, and that a Kindle was the first device, like electronic device, I let my own kids have because I'm
yeah.
like, well, all you can do is read a book on it, so that's fine by me.
There you go.
But it's funny to think now about we've referenced this a couple times before. There was this viral commercial in the 1990s by AT&T, and it was kind of like predicting the technologies of the future. And one of them it predicted was ebooks, but they didn't predict tablets. They predicted like books that you download to a computer, and not a personal computer at home, but a computer in the library. And
Huh.
so it was really
Interesting.
interesting how they couldn't imagine, not only could they not imagine mobile devices, they couldn't imagine people not going to libraries. And I
Yeah.
look back on that now and I'm like, it's easy to kind of laugh at it, but I'm like, no, I really like that. I like that even
Yeah.
30 years ago, people said, hey, the library is still going to be part of our modern world. And they were actually correct about that. I mean, my wife takes our kids all the time to the library because of those children's book that you mentioned. And because, a lot of times the children's books are really short. So it's
True.
like, why would we, buy 20 of these little, Magic Treehouse books when we can just rent or sorry, check out all of these books?
Well, and that's the other thing too about the library aspect. Like, even with the physical books and your access to them, the return on investment, which is a goofy term, but yeah, it makes sense, compared to usually what your tax dollars are for supporting a library is really, really good. I mean, in our county where, and a lot of other counties where the library doesn't get a lot of tax money. I mean, my property tax bill just came the other day, and I think my share of the property tax bill for the library is like $17
Mm.
for the year. It's like, okay, I go do one checkout and I've gotten my return on investment. So I mean, think about people who check out, even if you just check out a book a month, 12 books a year times the cost of whatever that would cost in an ebook and whatever. I mean, you're probably earning some of that, a good chunk of that back. And then, of course, like you said, families who get multiple children's books each time they come, you're definitely getting a good deal on that.
Well, maybe that could become the new slogan of public libraries. The library, you're already paying for it.
That's something that our libraries have always pushed. But the other thing too is that even on the book and circulation side of things, I think one thing that people don't often think about, and I know that other libraries have done a good job of pushing it, but there's all these other things, and I don't mean extra programs, but I mean like other services that libraries provide. Like in our small town, if you need technical help with something that you can't figure out to do, you've got either a computer shop with the owner and one employee who probably wants you to pay for it, or you can swing by the library and see if we can scan something and email it for you, or if
Hmm.
we can help you figure out how to get this form printed and downloaded, because the rest of local government is not going to do that. It's just not what they're supposed to do, really. So a lot of the visitors we get for help with other things, even if they're not reading something, it's I've got to scan and fax this document to get it signed for a real estate thing, or my bank needs this, or the health insurance has to have this stuff. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing too.
I must confess, Steve, I have not been to the public library in our area for quite some time, but that's mainly a job hazard for me. Publishing Lorehaven.com, we get plenty of books. And we've had some physical copies mailed here and there, but mostly just to simplify the review process, we do end up getting those digital books.
Oh, yeah.
And I have often wondered, a little behind the scenes here, but I've often wondered, does the act of reading them digitally, because we want to get them to the reviewer who's most likely to enjoy the book, does this in some way risk affecting the review? Because as Zach was mentioning, it's an electronic copy. It doesn't take physical space. So you don't have these really abstract 3D coordinates in your head about where exactly on the page you get to the Misty Mountains. There's
Right.
almost a mimicry of 3D space, at least for a story. And I don't think that for our review team members, this may be me overthinking it. I doubt that they do. But I have noticed, though, like I can go between ebooks and physical books, but I prefer the fiction in physical form if I can get it. I think that this does enhance the experience. I think for a narrative similar to a biography, as y'all were mentioning, I think the narrative does lend itself better to an object in 3D space, whereas I do a lot better if I'm reading ebooks. I do a lot better if it's a nonfiction, because now we're talking about theology or philosophy or something like that. Like that to me takes a different side of the brain. It's a different way of thinking than you would if you were going from a point A to point B, a narrative. So that may be, at least for some of us out there, I'm guessing that may be the difference. But I do remember, though, going to the public library before ebooks, before a whole lot of internet and everything. That is how I discovered the humor writer Dave Barry. My library would just have several of his books. I would just cycle through them.
Yep.
They also had Calvin and Hobbes books. So before we bought our own, we could enjoy some of those at the library. I also later in life, when I wasn't sure if I wanted to buy Harry Potter books, because, they might still be evil after all, it was kind of taking a chance here. You could get them from the public library. And when book 7 came out, I got in line to read book 7. I think I was the 37th place in line or something like that. But they must have ordered 37 books because I got to mine pretty quickly. And then we were talking earlier about Star Trek. That's how I got through a lot of these Star Trek seasons. Before
nice.
it was streaming, I didn't want to pirate it, but you could go to your library and you could get the DVD copies from Deep Space Nine seasons 1 through 7. So that's how I first got to enjoy that series. And it just illustrates that although there may be controversies and, the idea of libraries may get in the news for different reasons that are controversial. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is still a great tool that Christian families, readers, fans of any kind can enjoy in order to engage with these stories as part of your community rather than just as an individual. And of course, save some money doing it because, as you said, you're already paying for it.
Yeah, exactly.
One other thought about nonfiction books. So I saw this this post the other day that went viral, and I'm sure this guy got all this hate mail. He's like, "Hey, pro tip: if there's a nonfiction book you want to buy, just go to YouTube and type in the author's name and the title of their book, and they've probably given a speech that, like, they've probably given a talk that's the top points of their book in 30 minutes or less. And hey, you got that for free. There we go. I saved you a book purchase." I mean, I'm like, okay, I wonder if that actually works. But if it does, that's either a brilliant life hack or that's something. But
it won't work for me. Yeah. None of my speeches from my book are on YouTube. You might get them at a homeschool conference here and there, but not on YouTube, as far as I know.
Well, I
have to be a big author.
Yeah.
I don't really have a preferred format for nonfiction, but my main thing is I like to take notes. Like, I like to take notes in the book with a pen, which is a big no-no for libraries. And
yeah,
Steve, you can tell us
we frown on that.
I'm sure you've got some stories there.
Somebody using a burrito as a bookmark, that type of thing. Yeah.
No,
we don't even have that in the notes. We have to ask.
I remember that one. I've never seen the burrito one, but there's this story I always tell. There was a comic series cartoon called Unshelved, and it was a librarian and a cartoon artist who were buddies, and they wrote it. And it's like, most people who would check it out or read it wouldn't really get the humor unless you've worked in a library. It's for
Oh.
librarians. It's so spot on and so hysterical. But anyway, they came to a conference of ours here in Wyoming back in like 2010, I think, is where I first met them and heard of them and bought their stuff. They're like, okay, we ask this question at every conference we go to for librarians in every state. What is the weirdest thing you've ever found as a bookmark? And people would throw up their hands and they're like, okay, now here's our question. How many of you have found a strip of bacon as a bookmark? And in the back of the room, a couple of the librarians from the bigger library, their hands shot up. And they started laughing, and we're laughing, and they go, every state we go to, every library conference, including Hawaii, somebody says they found bacon as a bookmark.
Regular or turkey?
And we're like, wow, what a way to ruin books and also waste bacon.
Right. Yeah, how would you leave that bacon uneaten? Like,
I hope that it's.
But we've found
the
one that recurs the most that's odd is people will take out books about scrounging for different kinds of mushrooms in the wild, and we'll get the books back and there'll be mushrooms as bookmarks.
Oh, ugh.
Which usually is okay because they're really dried out and so they don't stain the pages. So that's okay. That's the funny one there. Every once in a while, let's see. I used to occasionally get CD books in the big heavy cases. They'd come back, you'd pop it open, there'd be an unused cigarette in there. I'm like,
oddly specific.
Okay. I know. I don't know why. I mean, it's not like you're going to save your place in there or something.
Yeah.
That's very strange.
So that's the weird ones there. The least favorite one that we have at our library is toilet paper.
So then
it's like we know where you were.
Yeah. There was a whole Seinfeld episode about that. I remember.
Yeah, we don't like that one. That's the one where we start making like, if you walk by the front desk and you hear a librarian making a fake vomit noise, that's why we're doing it. And we're probably mocking you too. More than likely we are. Just gonna throw that out there.
Let's break for a moment and go to our second sponsor for this episode. This is a newcomer to Fantastical Truth, author Candy J. Wyatt, who has written a novel that she describes as E.T. meets How to Train Your Dragon. Here's the cover description. Harley will do anything to keep his new pal safe, but a hungry dragon needs to eat, and the government is hot on their tail. Harley Megger's seen E.T. and knows what the government will do to mythical creatures. There's no way he's about to let his newfound friend fall in the hands of an NSA agent. When the dragon starts setting fires and eating livestock, the choice may be taken from him. Steria is only interested in filling her tummy and spending time with Harley and his friends. After all, they're the ones who woke her and called her from her egg. When the agent tries to capture her, she's confined to the farm where she's safe but without sufficient food. She'll do anything to protect herself and Harley, even if it means she'll go hungry. An Unexpected Adventure is the fun first book in the middle grade fantasy Myth Coast Adventures trilogy. If you like clean entertainment full of adventure and mischief, then you will love Candy J. Wyatt's unique trilogy. E.T. meets How to Train Your Dragon in an Unexpected Adventure. The audiobook is narrated by award-winning narrator Dave Cruz. You can get that and the book and more information in our show notes for this episode 128, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors.
Well, I love that there is a fandom for librarians, this unshelved comics. It's like the Dilbert of librarians.
It really is. Yeah. And see, I really associated with it because I am still the only male employee in our library system. In this comic, Dewey, of course, it's a little on the nose there, but Dewey is the male librarian. He's the only guy who works in the library, except for the library mascot who never takes off his costume. We don't have one of those. But but anyway, he's like the Star Wars fan. There's a great strip in there that I keep threatening my coworker, my staff now, that I'm going to do someday if we don't have enough people on. He had skipped out on a staff meeting, required one, by being sick at home. Well, the joke turned out to be that everyone who came there had a meal together and they all got food poisoning. So the next day he shows up and he's the only one there because everybody's out with food poisoning. And normally in that situation, you would just close the library and put a sign up and say, sorry, health emergency, thing like that. But this being a comic, they played it as he had to run the library all day by himself. So he goes out the front door where all the people are waiting and says, thank you for the wait. We've had a bit of an emergency, but we're going to do our best to serve you today. But before anyone comes in, I just want to ask this question. Who was the captain of the Firefly class ship Serenity? And this guy in the back goes, Malcolm Reynolds. And he's like, you're the first one today. And so he spent the rest of the strip asking sci-fi fandom questions to determine who the next person to use the library was. and he was taking them one at a time. And so the next day, the boss doesn't know any of this, and she's like, "Oh, it's really great that you did this." And he's like, "Well, it was rough, but we made it work." She's like, "I really appreciate it." But then she's reading the comment card, and she's like, "Why does this one say well worth the wait?" He's like, "Oh, I gotta go check the just so." So I keep threatening I'm going to do that someday. I'd be like, "You have to answer next generation questions before you come in the door." We'd have like 3 people.
We're gonna have to link to this in the show notes. That's a fantastic fandom, like within a fandom there.
It is really.
So we've already set up chapter 2 of this discussion. Steve, you've been talking about the general benefits of the public library and some of the insanity that you found at your public library, helping direct your public library. How do you personally, Steve, help share great books at the library you direct? And I guess we'll start with how you got into this field in the first place, because you and I have both been in the past in local journalism, but you moved from that into being an employee at the public library and now director there in Buffalo, Wyoming.
Yep. So I got fired, and that's the short version. And went hunting for a job. And the jobs at the time were like, you could go work in the oil field and make a lot of money, or you could work in fast food or grocery store and make not very much money. And both those were kind of terrible. And
both kind of greasy too.
I fell into this small mom and pop print shop, where I learned like some of the old offset press mechanical electrical presses and stuff like that, but also did stuff with InDesign and Corel Draw and that kind of thing. And that was for like a few months. But at the same time, a part-time position opened up at the library, and I'd volunteered at a small community library back in Maine when I was still newspaper reporting. So I had a little bit of that, and I was like, that would be kind of interesting. It'd be fun. I mean, it's not going to pay real well, but it could be a good end to get started on stuff. Little did I know, 14 years later, whatever it's been. So I went and did the interview, and at some point, either right before the interview or after, the director came back and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, this is now a full-time position with benefits and everything like that." I'm like, "Well, super." And the journalism thing actually helped, because they saw that, knew that about me just from my brief stint at the paper here in town. And they were like, "Well, we had a newsletter years ago, and we dropped it because the newspaper used to have a column where they'd have like library news. But then, of course, as the newspaper got smaller and squeezed more things out, that was one of the first things to go." So they were going, "Well, we'd really like you to restart our newsletter." And so, sure, I don't know anything about that, but I'll try it. Why not? Which is usually what I wind up doing with everything. So that's how I write too. So I got into that, and eventually that part of the career became doing the technical services aspect, which is actually processing and linking the books to get them into the electronic system so they can be checked out by everybody. And then a few years ago, my boss was ready to retire, and she encouraged me to apply for her job. So I did, and I got it. So
fantastic. How long have you been doing that now, public library director?
3 years as of July 1st. So 3 years and change.
Okay. And what exactly does that job entail? Like, you've already mentioned finding pieces of toilet paper in the CDs or the cigarette butts in the CDs, but like, what are some of the benefits of the job? Like, what do you get to do sharing stories with readers?
Yeah, as the director, one of my primary roles is to oversee the book selection for the library, what books we actually wind up ordering and paying for, and also, if books are donated, deciding whether we're going to put those in or not. I give a lot of freedom to, just because we've done this in the past and we've come to trust their judgment. Our different children, we have a teen librarian and a children's librarian, and they select their books and order them. So I don't vet every single one, but I know enough of their judgment, and we have enough conversations that I'm confident in what they select for us to have in the library. Myself and my assistant director, who has been our longtime front desk circulation person, we do all of the ordering for adults, fiction and nonfiction there. So really, part of the job is I get these book catalogs and review catalogs, and I read through them and find cool books that I want to put in. Keeping in mind primarily not just what I want to see, but I know this author gets a lot of readers. I need to get the next book. Whether it's a popular series or whether it's somebody who releases a standalone once every 2 or 3 years, but every time they do, there's a big draw of readers. I'm like, okay, I know I got to get that one because the last time we did, we had X amount of people who read it. So that's a good heavy influence on things. Um, and again, like I said, when people donate books, then my job is to just kind of see, okay, first of all, is the physical condition good enough to have here in the building? Is especially if it's an older book or a used one. And then, okay, is this gonna check out? If I look at it and it's like, we don't hardly ever get anybody checking out this kind of book, I'll probably just put it in the book sale. But if it's on a topic or if it's by an author or similar to an author that we've had a lot of popularity with, for example, if it's a like certain kind of cozy mystery or whatever, and it's like, oh, we've had a lot of those checking out lately. This is a different author we don't have. Let's give it a try. So we'll put it in and just see. And some of it is really experimentation. I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like sometimes when librarians pick books, especially if it's a new book by an unknown author, we're really just gambling. It's like we have no idea whether our local readers are going to like it or not. But we do have the experience again of similar books. So that's all we can really base it on. I mean, we can go on reviews somewhat, but sometimes, a book is well reviewed and we put it on the shelf and it just sits there. Other times, a book hardly has any reviews and we put it on there and it starts flying off the shelf. So it's some of it you think you know how you're figuring it out, and other times you're just like, I don't know. Yeah. So that's the highlight of that. I mean, I also do budgeting stuff and general payroll, um, some light janitorial work because it's a small library, changing light bulbs, unclogging toilets, things like that.
Yep.
Getting band-aids for people who injure themselves, usually kids.
Paper cut emergencies. Yeah.
Not too many of those, fortunately.
So you're kind of the curator then, is what it sounds like. How do you handle when requests come in for new books that maybe you've never heard of? Is there like a threshold of certain number of requests or frequency of someone requesting things? Like, how do you kind of screen that?
So we don't have any sort of written threshold. We have guidance in our policies for collection management, which is several pages long and has all sorts of criteria. But in terms of books, when somebody says, I'd like to have this book to read, the first thing we try to do is we have an interlibrary loan system with all the rest of the libraries in Wyoming. So we can request it and have them read it, especially if it's something like really niche, like a nonfiction book on some obscure topic. We're probably not going to buy it. Unless, again, we know that other people have been reading similar topics and go, such and such might be, we're small enough that we can come up with like 5 names and be like, oh, this guy and her and this other kid, they might like this book, so we should get it. With fiction, though, I'm pretty, I don't know if libertarian is the right word for it, maybe. Pretty libertarian about books when people request them. If somebody says, I want to read this book, can you please buy it for your collection? And it's newer, that means if it's newer, it's harder for us to borrow it from another library because with the interlibrary loan system, they usually informally restrict it to when it's 3-4 months old or so. They won't send it to you because they're leaving it for their local area, their county to have it first. So a lot of times when it is a new book, I'll just be like, you know what? To me, that's at least one guaranteed circulation. And most times it is in a similar genre to something I know somebody else is reading anyway. So I figure it's worth the gamble to buy it, put it in, and I know at least one person's going to check it out. So then that might go to somebody else checking it out as well. So I'm usually willing to make that bet. But in terms of, we don't have a limit on we'll only take X amount of suggestions or donations this year. Sometimes we just won't because of money reasons. And again, others, it might just be that it might be too obscure of a book and we don't think anybody else is going to check it out. So it's kind of a judgment call that way. It's pretty fluid is the best way to describe it.
Steve, I think it's helpful to remember that there are human beings who want to serve their audiences working in the public library system. And I think that that's important, mainly because, as you may have known, at least among some news outlets and punditries, there's been some negative press given to particular libraries. And I think that that gets turned wrongfully so into this view of the public libraries altogether are bad, or you got to keep your kids out of there and find the Christian alternative or something. And there may be some like larger libraries or libraries in particular regions of the country where they may have a particular event that you don't want to take your kids to and that maybe doesn't belong in the library, but that's no tarnish of the entire concept of library or every single library. And that's why I appreciate the balance of recognizing that there is still common grace in this idea that reading is still good, that community reading is still good, and that there are folks like yourself, your employees, and many other libraries where the folks are just really genuinely trying to serve the community. My wife grew up in a small town where she was, oldest child of a homeschool family, and the public library was where they got their books. They would just all go in there. They would walk out with stacks of books. The librarians loved them, and they loved them back. And I think to this day, there's a public library out there in West Texas with a reading room named after my wife's dad, who
Nice.
died tragically in the late 90s and was a beloved member of the community. And you find that just this common space that to me represents what we are supposed to do as human beings created by God. A few episodes ago, Zach and I were talking about the movie theaters and the common grace and the idea of showing up in a public space to enjoy visual storytelling together. Well, the library is just the book version of that.
Yeah.
It's even better if you're reading books together, even finding, little relics left over by the previous reader. There's a little bit of a human connection there, because human beings can be kind of gross and weird. And just so long as you're not, putting pollution in the book or marking up the margins or anything like that, then you still know, hey, this book was enjoyed by someone else. I'm reading what someone else has read. Like there's a fandom out there, even if I've not met them. But then there's also other ways that libraries promote this kind of community reading. How does that work at the Buffalo Library where you are?
Well, we try to put out different kinds of books on display, of course. And, this is where a lot of libraries have run into some troubles because the books they select to put on display, basically, no matter what the topic is, somebody else doesn't like it, without getting too specific on things. And we all know where that is. But I think people sometimes mistake the idea that because libraries are putting out books on display means it's not necessarily that we like them. Like we really try hard to divest our personal opinions on books from the books that we have or the books that we put out on display. For example, we've got a display out this week that my assistant director did that's all on things that are related to, because it's Labor Day weekend. We put out books that are related to like the labor movement in general over the years. And so we probably got 16, 20 books that are out on this table with some American flag decorations and things like that, to draw people's attention to it. And just
the Union story and all that, and how you get Labor
Union
Day.
story, the history of it, maybe some fiction books that revolve around unions and things that happen with them, things like that. But it's not like we're passing a judgment call when we put that out in particular on we think unions are good, bad, indifferent, whatever. It's like, this is what we have about them. Here it is. Read it if you want to. You're not obligated to read it. If you don't like it, you can kind of roll your eyes and keep moving on. So we're always trying to emphasize that we've got our books out there for the public to read, and we're trying to provide things for all segments of the population to read, because we don't know how many people in our community who have what percentage are of what mindset or things like that. You really have no idea, no matter what voting rolls tell you and things like that. And it's not our job to try to figure that out. Our job is mostly to get the books that we think people are going to like to read. They check them out and read them. They hopefully bring them back to us. That's the part we always have to work on. So yeah, it's really this shared kind of community sense of we're in the community, we're part of it, and we're trying to get you what you want to read, so that you can have this experience of coming in and finding the thing you're looking for without, and in most cases, emphasizing a little bit that you wouldn't have to go to the extra expense of buying all these books you want to read. And that's something we talk about a lot too with the public.
It occurs to me that, Christian, if you're trying to read up on the opposition, a public library would be the best place if they already have the book to read the book, to know what's in it, to understand what someone else who's different from you believes without actually paying for the book. So, boycotters, here's your chance.
Right? Use the public library, boycotters. Come on.
Yes, exactly. Now you're not paying the author. You've not given them the clicks. You've not given them the extra.
There you go.
Dough.
Yeah, it's a good idea because there's a number of books that have been popular the last few years that I just have no interest in reading, and yet, I've read tons of book reviews about some of these books. I'm not going to go into all that, but then I thought, well, at some point maybe I actually should read the book just to kind of hear the the author in his own voice or her own voice make whatever point it is. But yes, I don't want to own these books. I don't even want to Kindle own the books, but it would be nice to actually get a copy, and a library is a good way. But I've even thought about this for a bunch of there's a number of novels that I have like on my Amazon wish list where I'm like, okay, I don't know if I'm actually going to like this book. I don't know if I want to spend $10 or $20 on it. I probably should put this on my library checklist or wish list, because if this book is kind of a letdown, if it bombs, like I just don't want it taking up space on my shelf. I usually, for the most part, I reserve bookshelf space for books I know I want to keep, or that I know I'm going to want to read, multiple times, or that
Yeah.
I'm going to want my kids to read, and so I think that's very much a good use for the library.
Speaking of science fiction, let's jump over to our third sponsor for this episode, a bit of a robotic sponsor here. It is the novel Lost Bits, just out this summer from prolific sci-fi author Carrie Neitz, friend of the podcast and our next sponsor. Here's the back cover description. The last thing K404 remembers is a happy home with the human child L, whose care is his primary purpose. So when he wakes up in a landfill of tossed-away technology, his only thought is to reunite with his family. This world is not his own, though. It's a wasteland of desolate buildings, flying metal discs, and monstrosities that keep themselves active by stealing another bot's power. How did the world get this way, and why was he discarded? Hampered by imperfect memory, an obsolete body, and limited battery life, 404 sets out to find his home. Joined by other castaways, he faces off against scavengers and monsters, only to encounter greater threats. Pursued, outsmarted, and manipulated on every side, 404 teeters on the brink of annihilation. His only choice of survival? Those bits of himself, the connections he hasn't lost. We reviewed Lost Bits, and we said that it boldly leads fans out of dead wastelands, exploring the nature of humankind through the lenses of a human creation. That's an excerpt from our fuller Lorehaven review. We'll put those links in the show notes, as well as purchase links for Lost Bits, which I understand is also coming out in audiobook pretty soon. Just go to the show notes for episode 128, or go to the top of the page at lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors.
So here's a question, though, that I it might be going through our listeners' mind right now. You mentioned kind of different books that get promoted or kind of spotlighted during different seasons of the year. Is there ever a chance for like Christian books, whether fiction or nonfiction, depending on the season, to get the spotlight?
Well, I think it really depends on the library. And so here's the thing. We've come up with this a little bit ourselves because, as a library in a conservative state in a rural area, we've had complaints about some of the books. And the thing we always lean on is, it's a bit ironic because some of the argument comes from it's less of the I don't want my kid to read this, or it's the I don't want anyone to read this.
Yes.
And so it's like, okay, well, look, I can commiserate from a personal position as to how you're feeling about that. But again, when it comes to reading books, I'm pretty libertarian, and I think anybody should be able to read any book they want to. And so when you come to a library position like that, when we have people who are complaining about, I don't think you should have a book with X kind of thing in it, it's too bad you don't have more books that have, say, a Christian perspective like that. My response always to them is, I tried to put some in there, but also I don't know about all of them, so I need you to suggest them to me. And this is something we try to build too with the community of, I understand you don't like this particular kind of book. Probably it's not for you, might be for somebody else. But if you have a book that you like that is from a Christian perspective, I would like to know about it so that I can put it in, because I'm hearing from them that they know people who would want to read it. And for me, just from a cold, hard facts point of view, that's more circulation numbers for my library. So the trick is that we try not to do displays necessarily of specific ideological or religious or spiritual bents. So, for example, it's kind of hard for me to do a display and say, like, these are the clean reads necessarily. Now, we make up lists for parents and kids and say, if your kid and your family has a set of values where you want to avoid some of the things that are showing up, especially in teen books lately, here's some suggested areas we can look. Come ask us. We've got some really good suggested ones for you, but I can't really set aside an area that's like just the clean reads versus the not clean reads.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as for setting up displays, I've never actually thought about that before because most of our displays tend to be pretty, what's the word, agnostic, I guess you could say. Like the only real display I think that has any real specific political or cultural bent that we do is we usually do a display during Black History Month. That's the only one I can think of. The rest of them are pretty, like at Christmas time, we have Christmas books out. At Thanksgiving, we have Thanksgiving books out. Labor Day, we did the Labor Day display.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, when we had our primaries, we did a display about elections and like anything about elections, even like bare bones kind of didactic history books to fictional movies that involve elections and things like that. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's not like we can't do it, but like with most everything else in life, when you bring religion and faith into it, it gets a lot messier.
Oh, sure.
And I'm of the opinion that libraries should try to be as agnostic as they possibly can. Now, again, having a display that's like, talking about elections because elections are important and vital to the running of the country, that's something you can take a stand on and, put it out there like that. I also think some of it has to be reading your audience a little bit because while I won't avoid a book because of content, I might not get it if I don't think anybody's going to read it.
Yeah.
And that's, again, part of our judgment call process of, if I've heard a lot of people in the community grumbling, and let's say we have a book with a similar topic that never gets checked out, and then that author writes a new book that's raised some controversy, we're probably not going to get it just because the other book hasn't checked out. I mean, it's not, I really try to be as just cold, hard, factual as I can about that stuff. So it's not seen as taking sides one way or the other.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you here about there's a vast difference between I don't want to see, hear, or read this to no one should be able to say or write this, topic. I don't agree with that ideology or that mindset either because it can always be used against you.
Exactly.
It's like creating a monster and then losing control of it and then it turning on you and devouring you. I think that's just never a good, mindset to have. But at the same time, I think what distresses a lot of Christians now is like when I go, and this is more a bookstore thing, but like there's a very popular bookstore in town where during June, the entire front of the store was Pride Month. During October, the entire front of the store was witchcraft, and not like cutesy little Halloween stories, but it's like, here is how to summon demons, like how-to books, and it's just like
the thing they said Harry Potter was.
Yeah,
actually,
right. Actually, this is the actual. Yeah.
Well, then that is religious. That is literally an endorsement of paganism, of religion. Yeah.
Right.
Now, see, if that was me and we were working in a library and it wasn't me in charge and we had a display up about witchcraft, I'd be all like, "Well, you've got one religion up.
Well, there you go.
Let's have a display on Catholicism. Let's have one on evangelicalism.
It's going crazy around here at Easter and Christmas. Yeah,
it's gonna be nuts. So that's why, again, that's one of the reasons that we don't do that is because then you just open up this whole box full of everything you'd have to display to treat it as fairly as you could.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned too, Steve, the practical considerations behind this. I mean, you're not just there. I mean, I'm sure that even in a larger city or a more liberal area or whatever, I mean, there's lots of practical considerations there. Is this book circulating? What's our budget? What are the needs of the community? Which books are getting borrowed and which are not? What's gathering cobwebs on the shelf? I mean, I'm sure that among some librarians, as anywhere, there's some ideological crusading going on, and certainly the worst cases of those tend to rise to the top, and then they get in the news. But I think it helps Christians to steelman this whole scenario and understand the best points there, which are the ones you're articulating, is that there are practical considerations here. And among those is the the snowball effect of, well, if we try to put together a list or a display of clean reads, someone's still going to object to that. And
by the same token, somebody would come up to me and be like, "Okay, you've got clean reads. Why do you not have a list of dirty reads?"
Dirty reads, yes.
So, I mean, it sounds funny. But I could totally see it happening, and then I'd be like, okay, well, I guess I got to do.
I want some dirty reads, realistic books.
Basically,
I want some gore and some sex. Yeah, man.
It's not the young people who are reading 50 Shades of Grey.
No,
I'm just going to throw that out there.
That's we ought to have a whole episode sometime. Like, how did you deal with that whole thing, and what's going on with that? No, that would be interesting.
Okay, well, I mean, just as a quick side note, when 50 Shades of Grey came out, we just treated it. I wasn't in charge at the time, but my director just treated it as another book. just went out on the normal bookshelf with all the rest of the books. And everybody knew what it was, and it's like, but that's kind of how a lot of it gets treated.
Yeah.
Really, as you try to. I mean, I know that the content of books is changing a lot over the past, especially the past 10, 20 years. But the problem for libraries, I think, has been what role do we play in determining what content other people get to see?
Right.
Because in the past, it wasn't a problem because the publishers were, and I hate to use the word, but the publishers were really self-censoring themselves, self-censoring. But publishers aren't. They're kind of, it's like anything can go now. So the question then is how the library fits into that. It's like, yeah, you don't like that this book has this stuff in it, but we didn't write it. We didn't publish it. We're providing the access in case there's somebody who wants to read it because they might like the author, or maybe it's a popular publisher or something like that. The fact that the content has changed and been kind of dialed up, that's a thing. It's like, well, how much of that is the library's responsibility to police? And most librarians are going to come back with it's not our job to police it.
Right.
It's out there, and we're the content provider, to use a more modern term.
Well, and there's a difference between a library making a library providing access to these books that are controversial or whatever, versus a library that is outwardly promoting them, and making it in the spotlight, like this bookstore I went to. But I think that the challenge here for Christians is that the only way to defeat bad ideas is with better ideas.
Yeah.
The only way to displace bad stories is with better stories. And so it's really a call for Christians and others to step up and say, you know what? I can't stop people reading this book. I'm going to write a book or promote a book that is sort of the counter to this, and maybe a direct counter, or like more of a subtle counter. And I think that this is a lot more work. It's a lot harder. And I think that's why the temptation is, I just want to get rid of that book. And it's just not ever going to happen, I think, especially as we said at the beginning, we're in the internet age where people don't even have to go to the library.
Exactly.
It's not like the library is the only place people are going to access books that we don't prefer, books that we don't like, books that we wish no one would write or read. But we have to sort of step up and create the culture that we want to see take shape.
Yeah, I think it goes back to actually the theme of our last episode here on Fantastical Truth 127 about a code of honor for Christian groups. You need to follow the code of honor in the space that you're in, not necessarily the space that you wish it would be. And that's why I think it is so necessary for Christian fans especially, to pray for Christians who are working in the public library, trying to reflect common grace there. If not the specific grace of the gospel, you're still reflecting the common grace of curating books, finding the best ones, running a budget, all of those sorts of things, managing employees, scrubbing the toilets every once in a while, pulling the toilet paper out of the returned books. All of that stuff is part of the calling. If you're looking for more specific Christian books, or what you'd call clean reads, I prefer the term wholesome because it's more substantive than absence of content. If you're looking for those, then the location for that ought to be the church library if you can get one. We talked about that in episode 117 about individuals needing to build a fantastic lending library, and possibly going to your church and being able to do that to serve your faith community. So there's a specific need there. The code of honor, as it were, is a little bit different for a public library. But Zach, you mentioned the need for more news stories to help show more biblical truth or clean reads or whatever you believe in the market, because this really starts with reader demand. You can't just go to the library and make all the demands of them. Maybe necessary every once in a while, but if the readers want it, it's going to be an uphill struggle for you. But that leads us then to chapter 3 of our discussion, Steve, about your stories that you've been making for quite some time now, dozens of titles, and you can see every last one of them in our link in the show notes. What leads you, Steve Rzasa, to create so many fantastical story worlds, starting with the Face of the Deep series way back in the 2000s, and then moving on from that universe to many, many others?
My brain just won't shut up.
In fact, Steve Rzasa, we've been watching him. He has actually finished a new novel while we were recording. He just started it at the very beginning, and I think he's writing the epilogue now.
Maybe a short story, but no, really. It's just this. I don't even know how to describe it. My brain just is constantly churning on these different things I want to play with. I mean, like, there are literally, I've got notes written down on my bulletin board and stuff. There are literally like 6 or 8 more books just sitting there that I would hope to eventually do, but I'm probably not going to do anytime soon, maybe more. And it's like, sometimes things are just snippets of ideas, and others are a little more fully formed when they appear in my brain. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to explain. I mean, I've joked with some people that yes, I understand writer's block, but I don't understand idea block because I can get stuck writing something, absolutely. But when it comes to coming up with another idea, it's not. It's just a weird thing. It's really full up here. It's really full.
Well, somehow, Steve, we've managed to be booth neighbors at the last several Realm Makers
Right?
conferences, even in Atlantic City just a month or so ago. But I've spied on you, brother, and I see you like writing on stuff using your word processor, like in the middle of crowded rooms. And I don't know how you do that because I need a special sacred space with my music in my headphones. Like I need that in order to try to write a novel. But you're just seem always to have certain sectors of your brain devoted to that task space, and I'm in admiration of that. And it's resulted in not just the Face of the Deep series, which is your sci-fi series, but you've also got some paranormal investigators going on. You got some steampunk fantasy going on. Vincent Chin, Mercury Hale, the Mercury on or in, or Mercury preposition something is the title structure there.
Yes.
Is that 7 or 8 books now? That's kind of your
it's
recent series.
4 novels and 3 novellas.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So you can get that. And what is that about? If you can just give a quick pitch.
Mercury is like just this mishmash. I think Zach was asking me what kind of inspired Mercury at the beginning there. And really, it's this bizarre combo in my head of reading things like the Harry Dresden series and Monster Hunter International that I mentioned by Jim Butcher and Larry Correa respectively, but also watching things like the X-Files and of course Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Marvel universe that I'm constantly consuming. All of that mishmashed up is kind of what informs me when I'm doing this series. I mean, frankly, especially Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., because the whole way of how you fit this stuff around a real world or whatever is always intriguing to me. And it's been a really fun series because it's only most of it, vast majority, is only first person, only from his perspective. So it's all just like you're in the character's head all the time. And really, I mean, I'm just pulling a lot of things about my own varying levels of sarcasm thing and injecting them into this guy. Our respective love of pizza and things like that. But yeah, that's kind of how it got formulated. And so you've got this young guy who basically is working for this secretive foundation that by day does all sorts of good things in the community, but by night has him on staff to go slay these monsters that show up. And the whole gist of the series is that as things pick up and accelerate, and these dimensional rifts or whatever becoming more and more frequent and dangerous, he's kind of transitioning from, he sort of goofs off most of the time, but he takes it somewhat seriously too. He's getting more and more responsibility, more and more things. It's getting, to borrow Back to the Future, it's getting heavy. And, he's got to take more responsibility for himself, then for other people, then for like the organization itself. And yeah, it's a lot more on his plate. He's just got to step up to prevent various world disasters. But I love things where you get the chance to show super powered individuals doing things that are just kind of goofing off with their powers. Like I was not above him using his weapon, the pulsar stave, to heat up a slice of pizza when it was too cold. And other characters who are the serious characters are appalled, and he's like, whatever.
That absolutely would happen. Yeah,
it would happen. That's what I like about doing it.
Well, going back in time, you started off with the Face of the Deep series, which is of a genre that to me still seems increasingly rare. Now, we were talking earlier about Star Trek, which is atheist in space. Some people would say that Star Wars is kind of Buddhist in space.
Yeah, sort of.
A little bit, yeah. Now, Carrie Neitz, our friend Carrie Neitz, for a while there, he's been having some Muslims in space, and then, of course, Amish vampires and zombies and werewolves in space. But you've written one of the few stories that is Christians in space, which is the Face of the Deep series. And I personally resonate so hard with that because I love me some stories about Christians in space, and perhaps someday we'll find out more about that. But I enjoyed those books because you've got this far future. I mean, it's hundreds or thousands of years in the future where knowledge of the Bible has just been kind of lost. And then you have one young man, Baden, who, in the words of at least one version of the back cover, picked up the wrong book. And that launches this whole space adventure. It was an initial, really a two-part novel from the predecessor of Enclave Publishing, which is previously known as Marcher Lord Press. How did that story come about? Like, what inspired that, where you write a type of book that I just don't see that often?
I really do think it was a mix of, like I said, coming out of college and reading the Timothy Zahn books, which is where I discovered those. And then sometime right at the end of college, or right when I got out, was when Kathy Tyer's books came out. And as I started working on an idea for a space opera series, I had been reading Chris Wally's Lamb Among the Stars. So as I had done that, I'd known I wanted to do something Christian related because I'd actually written a novel while I was in college and then self-published it right after college. It's not very good, but it was okay. I mean, it's okay. It's not terrible, but it's not great either, is it? All right. But that was really my first experiment with it because I wanted to do something Christian related like that. And then as I was doing that, I kind of stumbled onto these other two and was like, wait a minute, this could actually be maybe legit. It really is. So I spent several years working on that series and kind of putting these themes into there. And it was funny because it was a really slow going thing because I had been working in the journalism field. And so I was constantly writing everything. And then I got home and you don't want to write for the rest of the day because that's what I just did all day for work. I don't want to do, I'm sure you can commiserate with that. But I had probably about the first third of what would eventually become those two books done when I lost my job. Then within 9 months of that is when I finished the rest. So just by virtue of I was no longer doing that, it was just this kind of freedom of, it was very clearly God being like, okay, now that you're done complaining and whining about the fact that you lost your job, here's what you need to do with that. I'm like, oh. He's like, see? So, and then, I tried the traditional route of sending it out to some agents and some publishers, but I was really new. I'd done like no research at all on the proper way to do it other than reading a few books. And some of which were at our library. I kind of stumbled upon Marcher Lord Press and had submitted it and got the note back actually not too far off this time of the year. I think it was like July. I was on vacation actually in New Jersey, Ocean City, same place I was going to this year before Realm Makers, and got the note back from the publisher saying, hey, we'd like to publish this book of yours, but it's too long, so we're going to cut it in half and have it be 2 books. And me not knowing anything, I'm like, well, I didn't realize that people didn't like cliffhangers. Rookie mistake. But all I heard was instead of 1 book, you'll have 2. I'm like, okay, sure.
Yeah. They gotten ahead of the game of splitting the book into 2 parts in order to maximize. Yeah.
And so then from there, I did Broken Sight, which was a follow up to that, and then after that, with different various things that happened, I started just kind of going, well, maybe I can write some other things that aren't space opera. Maybe I should try some other things. So then I did the Sark brothers, the steampunk, couple of books there. I tried my hand at fantasy, and I have to give credit to Kerry Neitz for encouraging me to do first person writing because I never would have done it if he hadn't pushed me to do that. He's like, your writing's really good. You should do first person.
Yeah, he really likes the first person.
He does. He's really good at it. And so a lot of kudos to him for encouraging me to do that because that really obviously impacted my writing going forward from there. And so then from there, it just kind of spiraled because I just kept kind of trying new things, and people would ask me if I was interested in writing new things, and my default reaction was, okay. So it's like those stereotypical movies or TV shows you see where the character who never says yes to things starts saying yes to everything. That's how I wound up.
That's a Jim Carrey movie.
Yes. Oh, Yes Man. Yeah. There you go.
Yes Man.
Well, maybe not the best.
Maybe not the best role
movie.
model.
Say yes to God.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I love the first book of the Face of the Deep series. It's sort of like Fahrenheit 451 in space. With the whole,
that's a good way to put it.
Kind of a whole space opera, military sci-fi, intergalactic conflict happening. So that was fun, and I've recommended it to a lot of people. because it's sort of like, hey, did you know that there are Christian sci-fi books out there, and that take both of those words seriously, and so it's a great book. I totally recommend it.
Thanks.
Oh, and they sell really well at the homeschool conferences too. Steve and I have been at some of those events, and folks will enjoy them a lot. Especially, I mean, it's a very homeschool friendly premise. It's somebody finds a lost copy of the Bible in space, and also there's a lot of spaceships and wars and lasers and mech suits and things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely something that is a good solid pitch there. It's also, I would say, interestingly, Steve, on your website, and if people go to that link in the show notes, they'll see in your repertoire, you've grouped the books that you've written under PG stories, as well as PG-13 stories, which I found interesting.
That's because I learned about audience.
Yes. Well, this is just part of finding your way along. You're out in space. You're hauling cargo around, and then every once in a while, it's just difficult to get a hold of a lost book and some lost information like that. But somehow you've managed to pull it off anyway. And so you've got PG stories, and you also got what you've labeled as PG-13, which includes the Deception Fleet series, where you actually have a co-author. And I'm less familiar with that, I must say, but it's one of those instances where somebody else comes along who's got like this whole sci-fi universe, like military sci-fi they've put together. What is that series about?
So, a guy named Daniel Gibbs, he wrote a series called, I think it's called Echoes of War. I hope I'm not. That's either the name of the first book or the name of the series. I forget. But basically, he's written what he calls the Terran Diaspora books, which is basically like, the best summary of it is that it's like space Christians and Judeo-Christian faith versus space communists. That's the best way I can put it. Summary. It's a really huge, expansive world. So you have the Terran Coalition, which is basically, the Terran Coalition is an alliance of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths in this one coalition of planets or whatever, pretty tightly tied together. It's not like a loosey-goosey alliance. And then you have the League of Soul, which is basically like hardcore communist, socialist, whatever, took over the rest of that area of space. And they've been at war for a while. You have different things going on like that. So he has this 7-book series which explores the war itself. He also has a side series that he had co-authored with somebody else that is kind of like, it goes alongside that series, and it's about this group of independent systems who aren't ruled by anybody, and either of those two big nations, and how they figure into the war and help out and things like that. He had actually put out a request a couple of years ago about, hey, look, I'm looking to expand this. I'm looking for another co-author so we can write some more. And me, of course, being like, yeah, sure, I don't have anything else to do, I guess, was like, there's the eye roll inserted there. I kind of talked to him, and I'm like, well, because I had co-written a book before, but this co-writing was very different. It's more of, once we get the first book planned out and done together, I mean, I basically just wrote the whole thing, and he signed off on it. Now, the first book was a lot of heavy, I'd send him chapters and chunks of it, and he would say, no, don't do that. Yes, do this. No, that's not how that character would react. Yes, that's correct. That's how that character would react, et cetera, et cetera. Getting the technical terms right. Getting more of the military protocol right, which I'm happy to say I didn't completely goof up in the face of the deep, but I still didn't get exactly right either, because he corrected me on a bunch of it, which is good. Always learning. So Deception Fleet is it's basically like Tom Clancy's Op Center feel to it, if anybody's familiar with that series. You've got a small team of military and civilian spies or agents doing these top secret missions, while you're also seeing like a bit of the politics behind the scene with the president and his cabinet, and you're also seeing the other military aspects, like their stealth ships and the missions they run, and the main ship, the CSV Oxford, which is like the spy base ship, kind of like the disguise ships the U.S. military used for signal interception and things like that. And so it all kind of fits together into this covert action spy world political intrigue thing. So it's like a Cold War that's going on. There's not the war is over, the treaty's signed, the enemy's defeated, but there's still a lot of sneaky stuff going on around there. And so really the Deception Fleet series follows this team of 5 operatives and their interactions with each other, and there's different threads, like the main character and his conflict with his family, especially with his parents, and running their family homestead back on the planet when he's always off and away. The female spy who's one of his good friends. There's this whole thread about. This is one thing I did differently. The thread of their friendship, like they're pals, and so it feels like there might be some hints that there's the stereotypical developing into a romance, but I'll leave it unspoilered as to how that all shakes out with his personal relationships and things. So I tried to play things a little differently. Yeah, so it's just a different story world. But the reason I have it under the PG-13 thing is Dan is very much of the opinion of, on the one hand, he doesn't want to shove a lot of gratuitous things in just for gratuitous sake. But on the other hand, as somebody who's dealt with the military a lot, he knows that the military in general, lots of people swear a lot. So we didn't do that with these, but it's not completely stripped out either. So that's why I say PG-13. There is, really, the biggest difference between that and my other books is there is some of that profanity in there, but it's really based on the situation. So if it's a really intense battle and things are going on and people are dying, you might see some of those. If it's a strategy session between several people, you're probably going to see hardly nothing. And it really varies throughout the series. So that's why I have that caveat on there.
That brings us back to the beginning now. Should there be rating systems in libraries?
Oh, golly.
For library
Jesus.
books. Maybe that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, I just want to know what it's like for Steve being a library director, and then also knowing that he's writing some of the books that you may be borrowing from your local library. I mean, you've got a double life there, but it's just completely out in the open, like Iron Man.
Yeah, right, basically. Like, here's my address. No, it's pretty fun. Sometimes people just come in and be like, I haven't read any of your books yet. What should I start with? And then I'm like, oh, gee, wow.
Well, it depends on your personality, right?
So do I have. You've heard me talk to people at Realm Makers. I'm like, well, what do you want to read? What do you like to read? Do you like space opera? If you don't like space opera, don't look at these books. If you like smart-mouthed monster fighting guys, let's look at these books down here. That kind of thing.
And if you like monotheists versus communists,
go look at it. It's
space,
like it's like, do you like? And then I go, well, now I go like, okay, do you like your space opera more like Star Wars or like Star Trek? And they're like, oh, kind of like, I like Battlestar Galactica. It's like, okay, well, you want Deception Fleet then. It's like, oh, but I really like lighthearted Star Wars. Like, okay, you want Face of the Deep. It's kind of fun like that. But I do have some interaction with people when they come in sometimes. Sometimes they're just finding out that I have books. Other times they're like, hey, I've never read your stuff before. What would you recommend for me to read? So it is really kind of bizarre because I'll be talking about other authors and then I'll be talking about me and kind of have to remember not to refer to me in the third person. Don't want to get that Seinfeld level of weirdness going on.
Well, I know that one of my wife's favorite books of yours is For Us Humans.
That's probably one of my favorites.
Enclave. So we're also planning an Easter egg for our next guest here, the Steve Saga. I want a quick pitch of For Us Humans, because you've got humans and aliens and a little Christian philosophy and stuff going on there. And I wish to stress that by my definition, Steve, everything you write is Christian fiction, whether or not it would be labeled that way, because you are the Christian hidden in plain sight, even if the characters are not acting or professing in that way. But For Us Humans goes a little bit, as he said, it gets a little heavier, goes a little deeper, but also has this kind of whimsical story of aliens living among, us humans.
Yeah, so with For Us Humans, it's an alternate version of our timeline. The biggest difference being in 2001, roughly, the aliens showed up. And instead of the normal conquest thing, they kind of were like, look, I played a little bit off of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Instead of blowing up Earth to build a highway, they show up and are like, look, your system is at a really sweet spot to build our corridors that we use, our portals that we use for warp drive or whatever. And they're like, we'll just kind of absorb you as like this kind of second-rate protectorate into our empire. We don't really care what you're doing here, but we got some rules and we'll pay you too. It's just kind of our leasing fee or whatever. So it's like more of it, because I thought about it. I'm like, all these alien invasion stories, the aliens show up and want to destroy and wreck things, even while they supposedly want our real estate. And I'm like, well, maybe the aliens just are, more practical and are willing to pay for things. And humans, of course, are like, hey, money, that's great. And so that was really the in joke there for that one. So the story itself takes place probably about, I think it's like 15 years later, the aliens have been there for a while, so it's all just normal. Nobody thinks it's weird. And I think one of the first scenes I have is while the main character, who is an art recovery specialist who hunts down stolen paintings and sculptures and things like that and gets them back. Um, he pulls up to a place and he's grumbling because there's the handicap parking access spot, but right next to it is 2 or 3 spots where only the aliens can park because their social hierarchy a little bit up above the humans now. It's like, ugh, great, those guys. Just because humans like to complain about things.
I see this happening, a little intersectionality with aliens there. Wow.
So it's funny because, we have, it really turns into this buddy cop thing. At its heart, that's what it is. You've got the hero who is this undercover art recovery specialist, and you've got an alien who does a similar kind of job for the alien empire. And they have to team up to get back this sculpture that's of huge cultural significance to one of the races that is like the big cheese at the top of the alien empire there. And this leads, of course, to the weirdness part of it and the philosophical part of it, which is that the human is best described as a backslidden Christian who's just down on himself. And the alien is really intrigued by all this Jesus stuff and wants to know more, which, of course, the human doesn't want to talk about at all. And so that's where most of your conflict is. And I did mess with I put a couple things in there about, trying to hypothesize on the impact of that on Christianity. And I went pretty hard on it in terms of, I was of the opinion, maybe cynically, that you would see a lot of people drop their faith like a hot potato. And on the one hand, I may have been wrong about that, but on the other hand, I have practical experience and personal experience with people literally leaving a church because they didn't like things like banner decorations or the pastor's attitude when he preaches. So to my mind, I was like, if people have left churches because of what we consider little stinky things like that, how much more would some people who maybe were a lot weaker in their faith might freak out and abandon things if they couldn't explain how sentient alien governments that are now at the top of the food chain impact what they view as correct Christianity. So yeah, that's where it gets heavy on that aspect.
I always say this, but I think now is the time for the church to really develop the Protestant church, because I think the Catholic Church is a little bit ahead of us here. I think the evangelical church really needs to develop a robust theology of aliens, of all kinds of other weird possibilities, and even just what does it mean if humans travel the solar system and create colonies on the moon or Mars or whatever? Like, how is that going to affect our views on things? Because I think we hold a lot of things just sort of we have a lot of unspoken expectations of what's going to happen in the future, and so let's just put those expectations on the page and analyze them, because apparently there were people back in the 1950s and 1960s that thought humans would never go to the moon before Jesus returned, and now we're at the place where humans might go to Mars and live there and then have children there. And so what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the church's view of that? So I think we should all just talk very openly about it.
And stories are a fantastic way to help us do that. We do, however, need to keep, at least in some way, keep discerning for sure. Obviously, stay grounded in a Christian worldview. But whether you're finding these stories at a public library or at a bookstore, at the homeschool conference, or just online, maybe at steverasa.com, keep an open mind about some of these issues. Like, work through them, whether they're PG or PG-13 or whatever. And I think the public library and sharing stories amongst ourselves are both great ways to do that. As we draw to a close here, you can find out more information about Steve, of course, at steverasa.com. That's Steve, Rzasa. Any other ways that folks can follow your work on social media, Steve, including whatever projects you have coming up next?
That's really the biggest one right there. I will share stuff on that. If you go there, I have a newsletter that I put out once every 3-4 weeks or so ish when I've got new projects and things coming up and information. So you can sign up for the newsletter on there as well.
All right. So steverasa.com, all links in the show notes. Steve, thank you for being our fantastical first guest for the Steve Saga. We wish you well. And now I suppose you can just tap your comm badge and beam back up to the ship and warp on out of here.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.
All right. Bon voyage.
Godspeed, brother.
Well, to you, our listener, we would love to hear your library story. What's a great moment you've had at your local lending library? What are some treasures you've found? What are some interesting situations you've been in? What's been your favorite bookmark to use or find in a book? Send us your note to podcast@lorehaven.com or comment on social media or in our guild. Speaking of which, we've got a great comment from Abigail, who shared some encouragement about our previous episode 127 about the Code of Honor. And Abigail says, quote, "Good episode going over the Code of Honor. It was both helpful and insightful. Not groundbreaking perhaps, but interesting to go over why things are done how they are around here. Lots of good thoughts about how to read and discuss courteously as fans," end quote. Well, thank you, Abigail, and I'm glad that was helpful to you.
I think that going over stuff that isn't groundbreaking is one of the most important things we can do to make sure that we add on to the existing foundation. In that case, we're not trying to build something new, or we're trying to strengthen the foundation for what's already been built, the ground that's already been broken. That's important to prevent drift. Continuing the foundation metaphor, I think you can actually go to the famous parable by Jesus Christ himself, who urged people to build on the solid rock and not shifting sand. It may be easier to break ground in shifting sand, but it takes a lot of work to build on solid rock. So we're just trying to follow the example of Christ there, and the example of any biblical organization, or especially a local church that tries to ground its foundations for belief and practice in the Word of God. So appreciate that very much, Abigail. Meanwhile, at Lorehaven, we continue to try to build on the foundation for the Guild. That is our Discord server, invitation only, but it's free to subscribe at lorehaven.com, and then we send you that invitation to a long-expected party. This week, we're going on an adventure in the Lorehaven Guild by reading J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy, The Hobbit. That actually should have started on Labor Day, Lord willing. We're going to catch up with Mr. Bilbo Baggins, who lives in a hole in the ground and then is visited by a wizard who invites him on an adventure, which Bilbo does not want to have. Thank you very much. Good morning. Until all the dwarves show up and start eating all of Bilbo's food and threatening to break the dishes and take him on an adventure to recover lost gold, lost in the mountain, guarded by a dragon. It's a great story. If you have not read it in a while, or especially if you've never read it, you will want to join this quest led by Elijah David. Get that link in our show notes for our Hobbit book quest in the Lorehaven Guild. Also, last week on Friday, we had an advanced review of The Change. That's the final book in the Chase Runner series from Mountain Brook Fire by Bradley Caffey. We have now reviewed every volume in that series. We got a big fan on our Lorehaven review team. That's a good place to be, especially for this series, which she has really enjoyed. So go check out that review. Again, links in the show notes. We've got more reviews coming up, and of course, more episodes in the Steve Saga next on Fantastical Truth. The Steve Saga continues. We're going to go from spaceships, superheroes, and a little steampunk to a spy thriller. Well, okay, maybe not a spy thriller, but we will have a certain secret agent man arriving in the studio. He's the one who's helped put together a lot of your favorite books in both fantastical fiction as well as nonfiction. He leads his own literary agency, Not So Secret Agency there, and he's also the publisher of Enclave Publishing. Steve Lobby will be our next guest on Fantastical Truth. Meanwhile, whether you enjoy the public library, whether you haven't been there in a while, maybe you have, as Zach said, lots of great memories of finding great books there, just as I have. I think that it's appropriate to thank God for this resource. Even in a world that has been corrupted by sin, where there may be issues with the library where you live, we can appreciate faithful Christians who find great stories in the library or create great stories on their own, as Steve Rzasa has done. That's something for which we can thank God as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.